And so Paul writes, for you can all prophesy one by one, or you can all, who is you? For all of you believers in Corinth can speak by inspiration one by one, so that you all might learn and be exhorted. And the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. That means those who are inspired to speak are subject to the same. Now listen, Paul writes, for God is not the author of confusion. How many times have you heard that quoted? How many times? How many times have you heard, let everything be done decently and in order quoted? Do you realize for every time that you've heard it quoted, from that day until this day, I don't know of any church or churches that are practicing what the apostles, now I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I'm saying I don't know of any churches that are practicing the fullness of what the apostles laid out in the churches. And yet people still quote these words, let everything be done decently and in order. God is not the author of confusion. What was the apostle speaking about? Do we recognize it? So Paul writes, for God is not a God of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches. All the churches. All. You know how many churches Paul had been involved with by the time he wrote this? Jerusalem, Antioch, Galatia, the regions of Galatia, Ephesus, Lystra, Derbe, Thessalonica, Colossia, Philippi, Crete, Cyrus, Rome, all the churches. And so, Paul writes, for God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. Now, let me just skip down a couple sentences and to verse 37, where Paul says, right, if anyone thinks he is a prophet or spiritual, let him recognize that the things which I write to you are what? Are the Lord's commandments. But if anyone does not recognize this, he is not recognized. Therefore, my brethren, desire earnestly to prophesy, and do not forbid to speak in tongues. But all things must be done properly and in order. Nobody can say that we don't know what went on in the New Testament Apostolic Church. Here's 4 chapters that cover what went on, what was supposed to go on, what shouldn't go on. There is no other apostolic model. It doesn't matter how many people don't agree. It doesn't matter how many people follow some other man-made religion. Paul says this is the Lord's commandment. And here you have 4 chapters outlining, describing, elaborating, showing, revealing what is supposed to be happening in New Testament church services. Now, I won't even go farther than this, because I know what people are going to say. Well, but brother, you can't make a church on spiritual gifts. No. You're right. You can't. But you have to understand that in the apostolic scheme of things, They were teaching daily from house to house. That's what Paul told the leaders at the church at Ephesus when he was on his way back to Jerusalem, when he stopped at Miletus and they made the 14-mile journey to see him one last time. He said, "You know my manner among you. I taught you daily from house to house, from house to house." So, the apostolic ministry and the ministry of the church, it wasn't based on spiritual. But the ministry of the believers, yeah. The ministry of the body, yeah. That did involve the full incorporation of spiritual gifts. Now, as I said, I know what people are going to say. Well, you can't build on spirit. You're right. That's not what I'm building on. First, we build on Jesus Christ. He's the foundation. The apostles, the ministers of the New Testament, they preached the gospel to people who are not saved. And they taught in the church. They taught believers, and they even taught from house to house. They taught at the temple. They taught people. Now, you have to think about this. It's very clear from the writing of the apostles that not everybody is at the same level. Some need milk. Some need meat. Let me ask you, if you had 10 children, all of different age, would you put them in the same class at school? Would you want your 3-year-old being in the same class as the 13-year-old? Would you think that was a success? Or would you see it as a failure? A failure of something wrong with the education system, the educational system. In the New Testament, in the apostolic church, they recognized not everybody was at the same level. Some only could partake of milk, and others needed meat. So, in the ministry of the apostles, in the New Testament churches, in the ministry, you had teaching that's going to be milk. And it's okay, because there are people who need milk. And you had teaching that's going to be meat. Why? Because you don't feed someone that's a 2-month-old baby the same way you feed a 12-year-old child or a 16-year-old child. You don't feed the same kind of food. You don't feed the same amount of food. So let me ask, if today we have service, well, we call it church, and we put thousands of people, because, you can feel more spiritual because everybody, even though Jesus said 2 or 3 gathered in my name, I'm in the midst of them. But anyway, you can put thousands of people, and, well, what is the pastor going to, the speaker going to share? Milk? Meat? Milk? Meat? Doesn't make sense. But when all the believers come together, as the apostles taught and instructed, yeah, you can still have the ministry of spiritual gifts for the edification of the whole body. Can you see? It's not the same thing. It's not the same. We made a cookie cutter mold for everything. And that's not scriptural. Evangelism. What's going on here? The unsaved are supposed to come to what we call church and get saved. And the babies are supposed to come to what we call church and get milk. And the mature are supposed to come to what we call church and get meat. I mean, and the people with marriage problems are supposed, I mean, it's unbelievable. It's not even understandable. And people don't understand why it's not working. Oh, come on. You have to think. You have to think. You have to open your eyes and look. You have to listen. You have to see. What we're doing today is not what the apostles did. And it's not what the apostles taught. You should be able to go into any group of believers and ask people who've been in the Lord, brother, sister, what grace did God give you to build up the body of Christ? Well, I don't know. From Paul's view, that would be a failure. Being stuck following one man, from Paul's view, would be a failure. Why? Because, initially, new believers need someone. What is milk? Milk is when an adult eats food and digests the food and produces a byproduct that provides nourishment for a little baby that cannot eat, cannot chew, and cannot digest. So, obviously, in the Christian process, there is a time for milk. But how about growing up? How come there was no leader over the church at Corinth? And Paul actually expected the people to be doing better and to not be dividing over men. Why? Because he expected them to grow up.